Promotion of conservation, the study of conservation, the way we look at artworks and the information that we're trying to gather to make those long-term preservation decisions is really important. You know, thinking about where conservators fit in decision-making strategies for the long-term preservation of contemporary art. Really nice to have living artists to bounce ideas back on. You know, we could approach your work in a certain way. Is the artistic intent more important than the materials? Do you want them to degrade? These are things that, issues that conservators are always facing, but we don't always have artists in front of us to have that collaborative conversation. We're making decisions with the collection manager maybe, or the custodian of the work, but not always the artist. So it's great to have Brooke Andrews here to discuss that with us and document that now. So in 20, 50 years' time, we can link that, you know, as we look at the materials and we look at the way the object is behaving in its current condition. We also have that information from the artist to make an informed decision of how to do the treatment. What is the end goal of the treatment and how it should look now. So the work Men 2011 by Brooke Andrews is a really interesting piece in terms of conservation because it has many composite materials. So you have the neon that's sitting around the frame, and then placed vintage photographs that are of anthropological subjects that have been then put in a wooden frame. And you know, your first thoughts are more preventive than interventive treatment because they're such good quality materials. They've been chosen for a particular look, an artistic viewpoint and subject matter. So they're pretty excellent. There aren't a lot of issues as a conservator, but if you look at his body of artworks, you know, there are prints and vintage timbers in the frames, but then also jumping castles. Like, that's a pretty crazy thing to conserve, needs to be used and accessed by the viewers to engage with the work. So that's a really tricky one for conservators to deal with, but a really interesting one to be thinking about long-term strategies for preservation. And it's great that Brooke Andrews is engaged in thinking about conservation and the longevity of his works, and that conservators can be a part of talking to him and addressing those issues while he's still alive.
Well, it's really important to develop a respectful two-way dialogue with the artist to try to come to grips with the artist's intent. And that could be a problematic issue. The artist isn't always accessible, whether that's distance or whether they have moved on from that particular message that they were producing at the time. So who decides? Is it the artist? Is it the curator? Is it the conservator? Is it the owner? Or is it a dialogue between all parties? But it is important to make provision for future problems that could occur. So for me, this artwork is all about preservation of the surface, all the surfaces. We have the metallic reflective rubbish tin, and we have the horizontally placed painting. What I think is really important about this work is that shiny component. The metallic rubbish tin is the means of actually conveying the artist's intent or the message of this work. Without that shiny, pristine, reflective surface, we can't convey the meaning of the work or even reflect the image. So both components are equally important. So there's several issues we need to be concerned with. Are we able to replicate the object component? If it is damaged, can it be substituted even for another shiny metallic object? Contemporary conservators of art need to undertake research into current artist practice and materials and techniques, and also make that research more widely available than the conservation lab. And in this way we can perhaps preserve the artist's intent and materials into the future.
I've been teaching at the University of Melbourne hands-on conservation for the last 10 years, and I've seen quite a lot of students come through that have a background in the visual arts, and they've come from being an artist to studying to be a conservator. And essentially what they're trying to do is they're trying to maintain both areas of their life. They want to be able to make money to continue working as an artist, and they can see conservation as being a corresponding field that they can do that within. Penny's taken it from a different direction. She's taken it from being a conservator and then becoming an artist. She's very good at bringing something to a point that it's conserved and restored at the same time. And she comes with a very fine art practice from the skills that she's honed as a conservator. We had a chat earlier in the year because she gives a lecture here on ceramics conservation. And she was saying that you also have to hear what you're doing. It's not just seeing or smelling, because those are two things that we do, and we also feel. So we feel the temperature of objects, and so we use our whole senses as a conservator. But you also hear, and she can hear if something's going wrong when she's using a scalpel. And I said, oh, yeah, I do too, but I hadn't identified it before. So Penny's got these really micro skills. So when you look at one of Penny's works, it appears to all come from one object. The porcelain elements all appear to be from one object. The plastic elements, if as a conservator I'd look at them and I'd be able to identify them as being separate and different in material, but she actually takes porcelain from different objects and she'll actually adhere them together in different configurations. To the naked eye, it'd be very difficult to locate where the addition and where the objects she started with begin and end. And to identify where one ends and one other one begins, then we start looking into analysing the object. So using equipment to start trying to verify what's one part of the object, what's another. Penny's a very good and much sought after ceramics conservator in Australia. She trained in the UK and had different training to what I had, and she learned a lot more tricks as to how to hide her conservation repairs. She's very good at bringing something to a point that it's conserved and restored at the same time, where the training I had was more to bring it to a conserved state rather than a restored one. So to elaborate on what I mean there, with conservation we only take the work so far as that the artist's work is still visible. And traditionally restoration meant that you would restore it possibly back to how it appeared initially, which is not what I'm saying Penny does, but she certainly has the skills to make it appear that nothing's ever happened to that object.
So there's no one approach really in conserving contemporary art. An artist might have a strong opinion or view about the conservation of their art practice, but this might change for individual artworks. And so therefore a conservator needs to be adaptable and flexible in their approach to the conservation of contemporary art. The artist Ghost Patrol uses a lot of different materials in his art practice. The most obvious material that is difficult for the conservation and preservation of his work is the use of live plants. The deterioration or the growth of these plants is important to the artwork, and whether the plants need to be maintained throughout the life of the exhibition or whether the death of the plants is part of the process. So if there's an artwork where the intention of the piece is for it to change within its lifetime because of the materials that have been used and the concept of the piece, then I suppose it's the responsibility of the collector of that piece to allow this to happen, and it's important for them to have an understanding of that as part of the piece. So conservators are sort of forced to rethink their methodologies in the face of these new technologies or new materials that are being used, and to continue the dialogue with all stakeholders. And again, this goes back to the artist's intention, the artist's vision for the works, and the artist's vision for the work into the future and its future display. Sometimes these sorts of issues change for the artist and it no longer becomes a concern for them, and then the decision-making process passes on from the artist to the custodian of the work, whether that's an individual owner or an institution.
Conserving contemporary art is complex, especially these days when there's a lot of new materials. Artists are able to use found materials that haven't been around long enough for conservators to know how they'll behave in the future. The complexity of conserving the artist's intent with the work Untitled Cubed is around the materials that the artists have used, which there are a variety, and the way that they behave. Now, the artist's intent with this work is that the strawberries and cream, the real lollies that we all would have had as kids, that they emanate life rather than death. So they must remain to look like the day you would have bought them down at the corner store, rather than starting to decay away. So this brings up certain issues of how we can, as conservators, conserve lollies. We have to be mindful of the heat that lights in the gallery space emit. If you've had a lolly sitting on your kitchen bench in the sun, it does start to sweat a little and release moisture. And also when we pack the work, you have air-conditioned trucks with air ride suspension, and the works are crated into specifically designed crates, timber crates. And so there's one specially built for the box of strawberry and cream lollies. And then in between venues, we store these in a climate-controlled space. And this climate-controlled space means that the temperature is regulated at around 20 degrees, give or take 2, and the humidity around 50, give or take 5. And these are classed as ideal conditions to keep artwork and lollies in. Now, I think it's really important for people to be able to understand that they can contact a conservator to discuss some advice on how to store or protect or preserve and conserve your items at home.